Hello, and welcome to, well, the discussion part of when does a Navy know it's time to replace a type of class of ship. And I'm going to have, well, it's over that way, the slides going while doing this, but I'm also going to be building a model while doing this. So if I just quickly, yes, I'm building the Porsche, from memory, that's what it was, which was 1999. Now, why am I doing this while talking about this topic with you? Well, I've recently decided that when I'm doing some of the more open form topics, there is a problem. There are people who just want the facts, which is a good thing, and there are people who want the discussion. And sometimes people want both. Sometimes they don't. And when I have the time, like I do today, or rather I don't today, but I'm doing it today because I need to make the time for something. To give myself a little bit of a break. It's nice to split up the two. So, the discussion. When does the Navy know it's time to replace a type or class of ships? Well, in the video which I posted yesterday, which was the first part of it, I started off by talking about the Russians and the Royal Navy. Now, every Navy has their own things. Every Navy has their own issues, their own peccadillos, their own political circumstances, their own parts and components of it. And so you sometimes cannot really come up with a hard and fast rule. I think I ended talking about how basically it depends on the perspective of the governments, whether they believe defence procurement is justified and what they think it's justified for, whether they think it's justified in a way of keeping yards open and providing civilian employment, whether they think it's justified in terms of defending national security, and therefore then what priority does the Navy have in that? What part of it is the Navy for? So yeah, those are some of the factors. So this is going to be a discussion point. This is going to be me discussing this with you. And because, honestly, I don't want to be concentrating too much on the slides, although, shameless book plug. I do want to give you something to be able to look at and something to be able to enjoy. And so I decided to do a little bit, just a little bit, of something interesting. And yes, it's me assembling a Lego model. Yes, at some point I will finish off HMS Belfast when I have all the parts. Kirby have been very nice. They sent back and forward parts, have gone backwards and forwards. They've sent me the wrong parts, they sent me the right parts. They've been lovely. It will be done when it is done, when all the parts are together. I will sit there and I will build it. But until then, I will have got better at doing this. And who knows? Honestly, who knows what will have happened by the time I actually complete it. Right then, apparently I have the choice of building this gentleman as a mechanic or as a driver. I think he looks more like a driver. Yeah, that looks more like a driver's face than a mechanic. He's smiling. No mechanic who's ever around something which is a high-performance car is ever smiling. They're usually just sitting there going, "What have you done to my car now?" And that's if they're in a good mood. If they're in a bad mood, goodness knows what they'll be saying to you. You'll probably be learning that they can swear just as well as any sailor. And any marine. So there you go. As he's happy looking, he is a driver. Right then. That's dealt with. Also means I don't have to worry about the hairstyle, which looks far too close to my own. Far, far too close to my own. Let's just think about that. Yeah, sort of. Yeah, we're not going there. So, ship classes. Well, honestly, you have to add in a third variant to this discussion. You can't just have it as a case of replace or renew or, you know, redesign. I think the actual topic was what was the phrase used in the title by Knight 601? Replace. Time to replace a type of. When does it even know it's time to replace a type of class ship? Well, there's replacing the ship. There's renewing the ship. There's also building continuation on the ship. If you look at the Germans recently, they've been doing this famously with their corvettes, with their sort of Baltic ships, because they've already got a very good design, and it's a very capable design on paper, and they want to add some things in and some capabilities in. But honestly, what they're doing is they're just building more of what they have. That's not a bad option. If you have something that works and you're prepared to invest, that is a sensible option to do. There's no point reinventing the wheel. I think that's the trouble we see with a lot of modern procurement issues, and a lot of the problems that do come about, is people's incessant belief that because something is new, it's going to automatically be better. Because it's a new design, it'll be better than an old design. And that's not always wrong, but it's not always right as well, and it's not always necessary, because sometimes what you end up reinventing is what you've already designed. You're just putting a new price sticker on it, and new symbols are going, yeah, it's a brand new ship, we've got something different. No, you haven't. You've basically reinvented what you already had in service. That was a big problem, of course, famously, really, with the LCS project. In that, really, what the US Navy was looking for was the Oliver Hazard Perrys, but they didn't want to call them Oliver Hazard Perrys because frigates were so last year. But what they were looking for was a general purpose asset which could do presence mission, which could do all sorts of things for them. And that's what they needed. But the LCS was supposed to be doing all that and doing everything else and all the buzz phrases and all those wonderful things, and then, yeah. It doesn't. It doesn't work like that. Kind of like me hunting for this part at the moment. At this point, I'm going to need better lighting. Because there's a lot of black in this build. So all the parts look very similar. I'm looking for something which honestly doesn't look like it's in here. I wonder if it's in bag 2. Oh, good lord. I hope I didn't attempt fate by starting off by discussing the whole Belfast thing. And this one is also going to be missing parts. That'd be really annoying. Really very, very annoying. Lego, I hope you're watching this, because you're causing me trouble. So what kind of component shape? We're looking for something which is the inverse of something I found already. Again, I had that problem in the Belfast build, in that I had parts which were not part of the build shop. Another part I did find a second ago, which was sort of like what I was looking for, has disappeared. Oof. Just check none have gone from the floor. No, none went down on the floor. Right then, so I found the mechanics bit. Anyway, so I was talking about the Oliver Hazard Perrys. I was talking about their various capabilities. And the fact is, that's what the US Navy really wanted. They wanted a modern version of the Oliver Hazard Perry. But they didn't want to call it an Oliver Hazard Perry because that was so last year and you were in the world of Donald Rumsfeld and everything had to be new. Everything had to be amazing. We're talking about the same guy who managed to... There you go. On here, I swear... I don't know if you can see on this map thing, but... That's the component I was looking for. In the light, it looked like it was black, but it's actually grey, and immediately I found the pieces. Yay. So, Rumsfeld wanted everything to be new. Wanted everything to be shiny and fresh because they were reinventing the world. The US Navy was going to be amazing. For what he saw its mission would be, which would be influencing events ashore, because there was going to be no major peer-on-peer conflict. There was going to be no reason to fight at sea. Why would anyone have a battle at sea? Yeah. Who was going to try and take on the mighty United States of America? Who would dare? Who would be stupid enough to do such a thing? I'm sorry, but just because something seems stupid to you, and it might be stupid, doesn't mean your opponents will share your opinion. It's one of the sadder parts of life. That just because something doesn't make sense to you doesn't mean there isn't someone out there who may be correct, may be misguided. Doesn't matter. They may disagree with you. And they may do that thing you think is absolutely, abhorrently stupid. Because they believe they're right. They believe... Sorry. My face is a little bit big up here. I'm going to move it. I'm going to move my face. All the way down to about here, I think. That should be better for seeing it. They believe that they are right. That's often the thing. They believe they're right, and that's what matters to them. You can't convince some people that they are wrong, I know. To put it more otherwise. If we consider, in the Middle Ages, and for quite a large part of history, an often very heavy topic in most wars discussion was whose side was God on. I mean, honestly, there was a belief, you know, that whoever had the most priests making the loudest case would have a decisive advantage in battle. Of course, then you had the fact that in quite a lot of battles, quite a lot of bishops ended up fighting in them as well, but we'll leave that to one side. You know, these things happen. Sometimes it's far more fun to get involved in the fight than it is to pray on the outside of the fight. But, still, and I say this as a still, it didn't always work out that way, because the same as with luck and various other measures of likelihood of success, fortune, God, most of these factors tend to favour the person who has the largest, most well-trained army. And as one of the most famous generals of his era and leaders of his era, Saladin, would have said, the person who controls access to the water. Yeah, it's a basic fact of life, but if your army is made up of horsepower and humans, then it floats on a sea of water. If you do not have enough water, you will very quickly be introduced to the fact that you will lose. And you will lose in a way which is going to be painful for you. So, that was the main difference between Saladin and, honestly, quite a lot of his opponents, especially some of his European ones. If you look at some of their campaigns, you can honestly see they have never fought in a place where supply of water was an issue they had to consider. There were always streams, there were always rivers, there were always something somewhere. The ones who did better will tend to be the ones who did actually have that as a primary scenario, or actually paid attention to their environment. It's a strange thing. But how does talking about Saladin, how does explaining all these things come back to ship design? Well, sometimes you'll write off a class and you'll decide to get rid of it because you've decided that that form of warfare or that mission that they were built around is no longer going to be irrelevant. A good example of that, you could make the case that the Oliver Hazard Perry class, replacing them with the LCS, is a view and a belief that anti-submarine warfare is no longer as critical as it once was. When I say that to people, sometimes they get very upset with me. So please note, I'm not saying that the US Navy necessarily thought that, especially not as a whole. I am saying, though, that there was a certain vogue of belief that because there was no longer going to be a peer threat, and there was no likelihood of America being in a peer war, and who was going to challenge America at sea, that the anti-submarine warfare could be left to the submarines and the helicopters, and you didn't need to have actual ships which are capable of doing the role. There's a small problem with that, just a tad of an issue with that one. In that, of course, the enemy gets a vote, and submarines have been the number one focus for people trying to take down others, or at least cause them trouble, for, let's be honest, the better part of 120 or 150-ish years. Submersibles, submarines, those sort of things have been a critical factor in quite a lot of that thinking and quite a lot of that thought process. Why? Because at sea they represent probably the best option for a form of guerrilla warfare, for want of a better scenario of explanation. They give you the chance to maximize your force capabilities while minimizing your force exposure, and often they are fairly simple and two-dimensional in their purposing and their processing, in that you're building a submarine to do an attack. You're not building it to also do humanitarian operations, to also conduct all sorts of presence missions, all sorts of peacetime operations. A submarine is literally one of the few dedicated purpose hulls you actually have in service in modern navies. It doesn't necessarily make them cheaper to build, because you can still find a way of adding complexity into that, very necessary complexity. But it does make them easier to focus in on the construction, on what's needed. It does make it less of a struggle, less of an argument, more of a, well, we know what we need to do, so this is what we do. And there are standards for submarines. There are, hulls and ships types you can look to and go, well, that's a good idea, let's base it off that, or let's go that way. This is one of the things which people often really don't seem to understand with submarines. They are in many ways a far easier procurement path, as complicated as they are, and as complicated as making assessments are, than a surface ship, because it's far easier to look into the future and tell what you're going to need a submarine to do. A surface ship, by its very nature, is going to have to be multifaceted and complicated. It just has to be. And I love them for that. I honestly do find it an amazing and wonderful quirk of fate that that's how it's turned out, because in many ways it enables us to look at these systems and go, that makes sense. That has that purpose. It also means that you have less of a fight when it comes to outfitting a submarine. Yes, you probably have a fight over, shall we have VLS in them, or a VLS pod, or shall we have it launch everything for its torpedo tubes? And there are arguments for that. Again, complexity, cost, size of the submarine versus the fact that the size and depth of your magazine. The fact that if you're launching everything from your torpedo tubes, you have one magazine, whereas if you have a separate VLS for, let's say, land strike missiles, you can therefore have the options of doing something else with your torpedo magazine. You can actually have more torpedoes and more decoys perhaps in there. But still. It's an easier fight than arguing over what type of VLS, whether you should go for maybe the cheaper option, which could be a single focus VLS, which provides you with short-range surface-to-air missiles, or maybe you want to go for the more complicated option, which is probably going to be something along the lines of a multi-purpose strategic length VLS that can take everything in it, but is going to require more space and more depth within the hull. And how does this factor into when to take it, replace a class or not? Well, can you refit it or not? Again, something you don't really have to think about much with a submarine, because once you start cutting holes in a submarine and adding stuff into them, you're talking about the, well, basically the hull life in terms of its ability to go down deep in depth terms, starts to get a half-life factor. Yeah. Again, one of those things which especially I find companies involved in the process don't like to talk about. They like to pretend that everything is going to be perfect all the time, and you sit there and go, well, yes, it's going to not be necessarily bad, it's still going to be usable, but how long is it going to be usable for? That becomes a factor you have to think about. And again, this is not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's something you have to bear in mind. Where did that catch? I should really get one of those fancy Lego removing tools, but no, my fingers worked fine there. So, if that's your scenario with your surface ships, why does this affect when you're replacing a class or not? Well, it's when you can upgrade a class. And at what point is upgrading them no longer any help? At what point have you reached the end of their career development path? At what point have you reached the point at which they no longer are a functional, viable methodology? And here is where another factor starts to feature in. And this factor can be a big one for navies. A really big one for navies. Are they going to get a replacement? Are they going to get a like-for-like numbers replacement, or are they going to lose hull numbers? Because if they're going to lose hull numbers, and yet they're going to be expected to maintain the same number of missions, because No one ever seems to drop down the number of missions, but people are always trying to going, well, you can do more with less, because this hull, according to our maths, is going to be far more efficient, and it's never going to have any excellence. Excuse me, Queen Elizabeth class, we can do everything with 2 ships. 2 ships, right? So we can replace the Invincible class, we can embrace HMS Ocean, 4 ships. Probably Argus was supposed to be replaced as well, but she's now been rolled into a different program to be replaced. So theoretically it was 5, but now it's 4 ships replaced with 2. But don't worry, they guarantee their availability. Okay, then Prince of Wales has, thanks to some issues in construction, some leaks, so she's not available, at the same time as Queen Elizabeth is in refit. So she's not available. So we have no carrier available. 1 is a white elephant. 2 is a potential. 3 is a capability. Well, an availability, because usually it is available. 4 is a guaranteed capability. That's why you have 4 submarines for the strategic deterrent. To guarantee 1 at sea and available. Britain used to have 4 aviation ships, primary aviation ships. An LPH, HMS Ocean, and 3 carriers which could also do the LPH role. And that meant Britain usually always could guarantee 1 available, usually had 2 available when you have 4. And that's a bonus. That's a scenario. And that's a good thing as well. Because it makes certain things, that's right, less of a problem. And what are those things it makes less of a problem? Well, it makes it less likely that you're actually going to be in a scenario where you don't have that capability available. But if you know you need to replace your ships and you're getting rid of the class and you know you're going to lose them, then the desire by navies, especially to try and keep them running as long as possible, is not only understandable, it becomes almost essential, because they know they're going to be dropping down capabilities. They know they're not going to not be able to do the same things they've always been required to do, because they just won't have those ships available. No matter how you work it out on maths and you go, yeah, we've worked it out. The computer simulation says this will never be a problem, that this is a 1 in 1,000 chance. Well, the trouble is you've got so many different components in the ship. And you've got so many different factors going on, and so many different crew, and all these things, and the crew goes through in these constant training, because you have new personnel go into the crew, older personnel leave, sort of thing. Or rather, new personnel come in, longer term, sort of personnel who've been with the crew go home, go to another posting, get a promotion to another ship. All those things happen. And it's an important part of building an integrated fleet, about building an integrated navy, that you have that happen. Well, if you have that going on, if you have that as a scenario, it means there's always room for human error. There's always room for, well, as I often tell people, life to happen. And in a perfect computer simulation, that has often not been factored in. Because the moment you start factoring things like that, it's very difficult to quantify. What position of quantification do you place on the likelihood of person X, who has been trained how to do something for 20 years, who has never made a mistake before in their life, being distracted that morning by, I don't know, the football results, and doing something on auto but not doing it correct? If that happens, how do you factor for that? You can't. Because your whole system has factored on that person you've trained for 20 years and who's done the job for 20 years correctly, doing it correctly every single day. Because Otherwise, you have to start factoring in all sorts of weird things to make that work. And you're predicting things based on people failing. And, well, again, that can sound like you are trying to run up the cost. To many politicians, that can sound like you're trying to run up the cost. And again, that's not ununderstandable. No, you can understand a politician saying that. Are you just trying to get away with running up the cost? Well, no, we're not. But the thing is, we can't account for this. And then you've got, of course, the whole era of people in yards. That's also a factor. So, replacing a class becomes an absolute nightmare very quickly. Replacing class becomes something which you have to give a lot of thought to. The other question, of course, with a class that comes up is its viability in terms of its crew itself. Because, again, if you have a class around long enough, their probable crew accommodation standards compared to what the crew want them to be, would like it to be like, and what it actually is like, are going to be some very different things. In fact, honestly, you could find yourself with crew retention issues because of that. Not because, again, the crew aren't... I think this is one of those strange things that comes up. I sometimes see people when I talk about this and they go, oh yes, they're not as patriotic as these. They're just as patriotic. But the thing is, they're away for a long time from their families. And to an extent, you have to look at the personnel you're trying to recruit these days. They are going to want to have some semblance of a home life. They are going to want to have some semblance of a connection with home. And the thing is, when you've got the internet, when you've got all those scenarios, you can see what your friends and family at home are up to. You can also see their quality of life. And you can see your friend who's got the same degree, same qualifications, maybe less qualifications than you. They're driving a nice car. They get to go home at 5 o'clock and be with their family every evening. They get to get up when they want to. They get to eat what they want to. They get to go out to dinner. They get to go to a movie. And they don't run the risk of getting shot at or hurt. And they have a comfortable bed. And then you sort of look at your own pictures, and you've got your own family, and you're getting snapshots of your family growing up, and you're in an old ship where the accommodation feels tight, where you can't find privacy, where the bunks aren't good, where you can't, charge your phone and talk to your family, etc. And you're away for months on end. It builds up. It's one of the beauties of the modern world. We have, thanks to a lot of military investment systems considered where the internet, etc. start off, we have got a lot of advantage brought in by all that investment in technology. But the thing is, that investment of bringing the world closer together also means you do know more about what your life is like versus what others' life is like. And that has a factor. And again, this is a factor if you consider for the Royal Navy and other navies in a lot of their Cold War era ships, especially with those ones which are still around. They're good ships, yes. But are they the right ships for now? And when you replace them, what are you replacing them with? Which opens up, of course, another debate, because then that's working out what are the missions, and that's what I started off by discussing when I was talking about the things at the beginning. What are the missions you're going to be discussing, you're going to be doing? What missions do you think are a factor? And we're not talking missions over the next year, we're talking the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. You have to be looking 30 years ahead. This is why I find it funny when people talk about the future of strategy when I'm sort of talking that through. Because people look at me and sort of go, well, you know, that's not going to be like in the next 5 years or this or whatever. The future of strategy is not 20, 30 years. We're not talking about that time. We're talking 30, 40, 50, 60 years, 100 years we're looking at. The weapon systems that are going to be in use in the period we're talking about and we're considering strategy for don't even exist yet. Are a long way from existing yet. And again, there is no problem with that. That is part of life, and that is part of the scenario we have to think through. So what's the point of thinking about it then, usually is the question I get asked when I start talking about it. If you're thinking so far ahead that we can't even really predict the weapon system, what's the point of thinking? Because if you consider the weapon systems take 20 to 30 years to develop, sometimes, and they're going to be in use for 30 years, you need to be thinking 60, 90, 100 years ahead to work out what you need to do and how you need to go about it. Now, I know I'm supposed to do those stickers off the vehicle, but honestly, this way I can guarantee I won't get them confused. Look, I know me. So that's a core factor. You have to start thinking about what likelihood of war is, what likelihood of conflict is, what you're likely to be dealing with that far in advance. And that's quite scary. And that's well out of place, considering how I have lined this up with the back corner, which they seem to have done on the thing. This is why where having big thumbs is not really a good idea, and where tweezers would possibly be sensible, but I find them annoying and a bit pretentious to be using them for Lego. But that's my personal views. It doesn't mean it doesn't apply to anyone else. Okay. So, we do have to start thinking a long way in advance when we are talking about replacing ships and when we're talking about renewing ships. We have to start thinking a lot about what they're going to be, because let's be honest, with the surface ships, there is the very real probability that they will go through multiple service life upgrades and have multiple types of weapon systems installed them over that career. That's a very real possibility. So again, you have to factor in that upgradability. Again, you're back to the whole Stanflex discussion, which I had during the slide video. Stanflex is a very good idea, apart from if you want necessarily some of the most high-tech systems, because Stanflex is not really a system designed around that. Stanflex is designed around being a modular, accessible system for a medium power that, let's be honest, is not really thinking about being... I put this? At the front of operations on their own. And that is not meant to be something nasty about the Danish. In fact, it's a very sensible thing. They've looked at it and gone, right then, we're part of NATO. If we're involved in major naval operations, we're probably going to be slotting into NATO or European operations. We are not going to be going out and taking on the Russian Navy solo. That's not what we're going to be doing, and that's not what we're about. I like that about them. I think that kind of thinking is sensible to think through. Whereas, if you consider, again, for another medium power, a larger medium power, i.e. France or Britain, well, there are scenarios where France and Britain can end up fighting alone. Britain, of course, had that drummed into them in 1982, where their allies were very good and very protective and basically were very nice at supplying stuff. In the case of the French, occasionally supplying to others, but there again, you know, they sorted that out. Eventually. Sorry, winding up the French is what the British do. We've got this entire book titled 1,000 Years of Annoying the French. For a British person, it's kind of like breathing. They're our next door neighbours. But, and this is a factor which has to be considered, for both Britain and France, through different circumstances, they can find themselves on their own in a battle. They could find themselves doing an operation without the assistance of the rest of the NATO powers. And they have to factor that into their contingencies. They have to factor that into operations. That's why, out of NATO, they're the two who operate the largest aircraft carriers. Now, would I love Britain to have more aircraft ordered already on for its aircraft carriers? Yes, I would do. But one of the factors that the British had when they were spreading out their procurement was near term they didn't expect any conflict. They expected the conflict to be something further down the field. So what they thought was, well, what we want to do is we want to buy the most suitable aircraft to then, rather than have airframes which have already been used up their life expectancy, and airframes which have already had, you know, might not be the most modern available unless we've refitted them. So we'll spread the purchase down further down the field. Okay, if you're thinking, that doesn't sound the most sensible to me, you would be right. The more sensible thing would have been to buy some and just keep on buying them. Which should have been done with lots of things, you know. A good example of the silliness of not keep on buying stuff is the space shuttle program, where the Americans should have probably kept them in low-rate production, but decided it would cost too much money, which meant the space shuttle fleet got older, kept being used, and that annoying thing known as the airframe life started to be a factor. And started to be a factor in terms of their availabilities. Again, this is not something bad about the aircraft. This is a fact of life. Metal fatigue is a fact of life. It's something that comes up whenever you're using materials. Well, any sort of material can suffer from fatigue, even wood. I did include wooden ships in the slides, and the reason I put the wooden ships in the slides was because, frankly, they're often forgotten that they did actually suffer from fatigue. Again, nothing wrong with that. It's what happens. Materials, there is nothing you can build that's going to last forever. Not even concrete, sadly enough. Although some people do seriously seem to think that concrete will last forever. But it won't. Even concrete wears out and wears down. Even concrete. Oh, I'm so glad I already put on 21 and 26, because that would have been far more difficult after putting those in. Yep. Right then, it wants me to put on 31, 30, 29 and 28. Ah, cute. So, back to when to replace a class. Well, here's the scary thing. Most classes enter service with an out-of-service out-of-service date already factored into their design. Very few classes have ever actually gone out of service on their out-of-service date. Some have gone out of service earlier. That was not sensible. The fleet was not structured around that. They were supposed to be still in service, they were still supposed to be stable for operations. But it happens. It happens more often than we like to think about. Next worse than that is service life extension packages. Why is that next worse? Why is that a factor which is a problem? Well, why a service life extension can sound like a really good idea because it's going to keep the ships in service for longer. But it means that there's going to be a lot of cost put into them, into extending their life, which is going to be cost which is not available, funding and time which is not available for building the next class. It's also going to, by extending their life, going to change some of the criteria for your next class. Because they're now going to be entering service later. And if they're entering service later, then that's another, the 20-30 years they have to be designed for changes. Now you can leave the design the same, but you can often argue that half the problems that have been with ongoing projects is because they keep lengthening the time in service of the classes in service and going, yeah, we'll just keep them in service. And the fact is, with the projects which are being built, they're either at a point at which they take them back to the design board and start again, which means they have to start off by making a whole new set of assumptions. They have to start thinking things through again. Which people always go, oh, that's not onerous, that shouldn't take too long. Well, it does when you're trying to think out what's the likely world they're going to be dealing with, what's the likely scenario you're going to be dealing with 20, 30 years in advance. Because that's what you're having to consider. So you're doing that, and at the same time, you're also working out what is cost efficient to add into the existing class that's in service. And please note that phraseology. What is cost efficient? Because some things you might actually sensibly want to put in, but it's not cost efficient to do so. It's going to cost too much in terms of the actual financial cost, or in terms of the whole life, or the hull, the amount of work you're going to need to do in the hull, and the time it's going to take in the dockyard. So you've got all that extra work coming from deciding, well, we'd rather save the money and not start launching into a new class just yet, and usually it is about saving money. And, we want to spend more time thinking about what the future class is going to be like. Okay, well, that's just run up a whole load of extra bills for no gain. Now, sometimes it is actually sensible to do that, though, because sometimes you could find the design you're planning on putting in is absolutely terrible. There are some times where you'd actually would have liked them to have done a little bit more of an effort in this process, perhaps. To have done a little bit more considering about whether or not it was a good idea, what they're planning. If you're wondering when that is, of course, again, you can point to the LCS. We know a lot about that, but there are lots of other programs out there which have had other interesting issues. And one of the things I would be very careful about is saying, well, you know, this Navy doesn't seem to have issues. I would say no Navy in the world does not have issues. The thing is, what kind of system are they in and how good are they at covering it up? About pretending they don't have issues. Quite often, if you start talking and start wandering around and know anything about what you're looking at, you can work out what any Navy's particular issue is. Especially with any ship that's sort of being designed, because again, certain factors are universal. Especially when you're keeping older ships in service. Older ships being kept in service, they are costly, they have problems, and you have to take care of those problems to keep them in service, which is going to cost money. And especially if you're in a scenario where you actually have a lot of support and you can tend to write blank checks, if you're doing that, that's because there's a problem with the newer class. That's supposed to be coming into service, and then you look at that class and you go, ooh, what's your issue? What is your issue? There we go. I do love the way it's sometimes more lit up actually on the screen, and I can see the parts more clearly here than I can actually looking at them myself. Not sure why that is. Screen brightness, probably. Right then. So when does a Navy know it's time to replace its ships? Well, theoretically they should know from the moment they're launching them. They should know from the moment they're building them, because they should have that all programmed in. The whole idea of when are we going to replace these ships should be a factor which they have developed from the get-go. But, as said, the world likes to change. That is cool. That is very cool. And it likes to change on a whim. Seemingly. As far as many naval officers are concerned. Ah, that's better. That's plugged in. But really, it doesn't change on a whim. Really, you can often see these things coming, because, again, it's kind of predictable. Different governments will have different emphases. There used to be, what was it? The joke about the Republicans and Democrats in America. The Republicans wanted a huge military and to do basically nothing with it. The Democrats wanted a smaller military, but didn't want to do anything with it. But wanted a small military, but always wanted to do stuff with it. They wanted to change the world, basically. And again, what we're saying, that's not necessarily a bad thing to want to change the world. And sometimes the only way you can change the world is to use military force, i.e., stopping Adolf Hitler, etc. You know, he's not the type who's going to change because you want him to. And honestly, there are more Adolfs out there than we would probably like to believe. They might not do the same things as that Adolf, but yeah, that kind of dictatorial personality, which doesn't matter really. It doesn't really care what kind of political hue they take charge. They use as a vehicle to get to the top. Once they get to the top, they pretty much turn into the same thing, whatever they are. There is no real picking between any of them. Well, the only way you can really deal with them, often, is military force. Either to hem them in which case you're leaving their own people at their tender mercies, but, you know, you can maybe do that as a deterrent without actually having to start a war. So that can be rather attractive. Or you actually go in and take them out. It's not a good option. But in that scenario, there's often no good options out there. You can argue that, yeah, why do we want to do that? Because it's not, you know, it's risking our lives. For what value for us? Well, in the end, there is a value in getting rid of people who are just like that. Because if they're not got rid of, if they're not dealt with, they have a habit of finding a way to spread the problem. It's not guaranteed they'll find a way, but they have a habit and they do try very hard. So then you go deal with them. And that's just as complicated. And this is a procurement problem, because let's say your systems are procured by someone who wants to spend money on lots of defensive systems, and then they're used by someone who would prefer to have a smaller military, but wants to use them for things. Well, those two different governments are going to have different priorities in terms of their programs. One might go for very high-tech, very advanced gear that looks and sounds really cool and does a lot of research. You know, requires a lot of budget for that sort of things. The next one, well, for their operations, you could be talking about a very infantry-focused force to do counterinsurgency and dealing with the remnants of that particular individual's regime. Or sometimes just an annoying neighbour who likes to cause trouble, who decides to take advantage of the situation in that country to cause trouble. Because often that happens in the world, because, look, again, there's a very real scenario that, you know, that if you have a room full of people, similar people will find each other. Similar with, it sometimes works out similarly with nations, in that nations which are next door to each other will fall prey to similar problems at a similar time. That was some of the idea behind the domino theory. It doesn't necessarily work out like that. Please note, it is not a hard and fast rule. It's just basically something can look across the border very attractive to people who are searching for a solution to problems which they don't know how to deal with. Dictatorships and of whatever political hue can look very attractive when you're dealing with a crisis and you're going, we need someone to make fast decisions, to be directing this, to, you know, really strong, really powerful and present, and, you know, do the right thing. Whatever the right thing is, because that can change to be different depending on your perspective. But the trouble is, those kinds of organizations can look really efficient and can seem really effective until you realize they don't tend to do well with criticism. And they tend to also look effective. They're not necessarily effective. And that's a difference. Looking effective versus actually being effective. And again, this affects naval procurement. How does it affect naval procurement? Well, because... And, you know, you're looking at your next door neighbours. They are going to be... Let's say your next door neighbours are such a country. They're going to be talking longly and loudly about how great and how amazing their armed forces are. Okay, that's good. They're your next door neighbours. They also occasionally talk about how historically they controlled some of your land. Oh, great. How does that factor into your procurement? How does that factor into what you're building, into what you're planning, and into the classes you have? Because you might have classes which were built, of ships which were built around just doing the presence mission and the police and the maritime security mission. Good missions, key missions, critical missions. But not what you need when you've got a next door neighbour who sounds like they are, is making and constantly goose-stepping around, talking about how efficient and amazing they are and scaring your public with that view. But, well, how do I put this politely? That goes there. But in reality, aren't necessarily that much of a threat. But the thing is, they might believe them and start believing their own hype, and they might become that much of a threat. Okay, what do you do? How do you manage that? What do you do in terms of procurement? Do you change your procurement pattern? Do you start procuring vessels which are perhaps less good at the maritime security mission, but are more good at the maritime conflict and naval conflict mission and the fighting wars mission? It makes sense to do so. After all, you've got a visible threat you've got to worry about. But you do that, you can then find yourself very quickly in a scenario where you need the maritime security, where the next door dictatorship decides to become an absolute civil war because some people, let's say, decide they really don't like living in a dictatorship. At which point you have to deal with disaster relief as the entire country collapses into civil war. You've got refugees streaming out. You've got all sorts of problems to manage and deal with. And your ships, everyone's looking at, why aren't our ships better suited to this mission? Well, because we've been orientating them around this mission. Because it was the sensible mission to be orientated around, because the threat was, the greater threat to us, at the time, quite we judged, was war. Not national collapse. I think that's right. Oh. Where does this go? Oh, that goes along there. Okay. That makes sense. And that fits there. Okay, now for the other side. So you can make the right decisions and still be considered wrong, and then that can muck up your future procurement, because you could then go and procure vessels or adapt vessels to humanitarian relief to deal with that mission in maritime security, and then find yourself later within that cycle actually fighting a war and going, oh wait, what do we do here? Which is a legitimate question to again ask. What do we do here? How do we deal with this? Because we're now fighting a war, but we were just reorientated ourselves around the humanitarian mission because that was what was going on. And that could be because with you watching one of your next door neighbours, your other next door neighbour also decides to become a bit weird and decide to start a war for apparently no apparent reason. Okay. I am sorry, system, and instructions, but I appear to have skipped ahead of you. Just a tad. Yes, I did that bit. I know I should follow the instructions, but now I can figure them out. Eventually. Sort of get it right. So, when to replace a class? Oh, it's not an easy subject. It is. I'm probably, wandering all around the place because it is a very, very long-winded and wandering around discussion. It really is. There are times when you wish it wasn't so, when you wish it was straightforward and you could go, well, you just do this. This is the right decision. Well, it's not. Because sometimes for some nations, it's going to be correct to wait. Because if you wait, you're going to see how the world works out a bit more, which might give you just the information you need to properly design a class which can fit your needs for the next 30 years. Might do. It might be you wait, you get caught by war, turning out, and you don't actually have any ships available which can do the missions you need to do because you waited so long. Again, that's happened rather a lot. History is a nice thing. It's replete with examples of people doing the right thing and people doing the wrong thing, and often they're doing the exact same thing. Just it worked out for one, it doesn't work out for the others. And that's where things get really, really annoying. Who does it get annoying for? Well, pretty much everyone, because, you see, what humans as a rule also want when they are deciding these things, when they are, trying to work out this sort of stuff, what they want going to do, what they're going, how they're going to do it, is they want certainty. They want to know they are making the right decision. They want to know that they are going to be correct, that they are going to be able to do the right thing. And again, the problem you have with humanity and history is that often doing the right thing is very difficult to work out what the right thing is. When you can work out the right thing, it's often days which, well, to quote President Jebediah Bartlett of the West Wing series, usually days which involve a body count, which you'd rather not have happening that often. And the whole point about procurement, and of course when you get a class, etc., is that in the ideal world, if you get it right, you can deter conflict. And you won't have, and this is the important thing, you won't have a conflict. If you do the correct in procurement, you can avoid the war. That's the aim. Although the dirty secret is that if a nation's leadership is truly intent on conflict, then nothing you do will change that. Or rather, if they are truly intent on doing something, getting something by whatever means necessary, and they really don't care, and they think that they can get away with it, then they will push and do it. Whatever. So that's going to have the Porsche on it. It's slightly skewy, but not that bad. That's good enough that I'm not going to try and keep taking off and on, because again I find the stick goes. And yeah, that's when things get really annoying. Because that is incredibly frustrating for all involved. Because the idea you're told whenever you're running procurement and you're doing those sort of things, is that get this right, you can prevent wars. Get this right, you can deter conflicts. But sometimes, even when you're right, even when you get it right, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter, because they're going to do what they want to do, and what they want to do is often something on the variations of achieve immortality, become a legend, right some historical wrong, achieve the status of their nation for what they are, its rightful place in the sun, These are the various things which come out to justify war at various points. When it's slightly off center. It would be the middle one which is off center. The very one which needs to be in the center. I hope you found the discussion interesting. This is almost over and this is almost done, and I'm now being very careful about what I say, because if I start off on some of the other topics within it, I could end up discussing longer than I have this to build. And it is a long discussion when we're talking about procurement, when we're talking about future strategy, when we're talking about when classes are going to come to an end. We are taking in a massive range of factors. And you have to. Now, theoretically, I should have 2 grey ones, I think, for this job. But I can't see any grey ones. I'm also supposed to have some black versions of these. But I cannot see them. Oh, that's because I already did that ages ago. I was looking for it and going, where is that? And then going, oh, I already did that. Yeah, well. Yeah. Already done it. If you wouldn't mind, if you pop in there, then I'm not gonna worry I'm gonna lose you. And that will be doing something like that, I presume. Though it doesn't fit with you sitting in there, so might be going to change that round a bit. Not sure. We'll see what they do. We see what they have me do. And surprisingly, well, that's not. So obviously that's going to go on the front. Okay. Alrighty then. So that goes there. And that goes there. That goes there. And that goes there. In reverse of what's up here. Okay. And then we have these two go here and here. And they get that. And that. That. Yep. Okay, so if I stick that there and put that at this jaunty angle and stick that over that, and that is correct. And where is the other white piece? It was in here, hiding in there. That was not helpful for you to hide underneath there. That looked good. That does look good. Okay, so I'm supposed to stick that and that, that, onto that, into that, and put that in there. Ooh, that does look nice. And I'm guessing again I should stop jumping ahead of the instructions, shouldn't I? That into that. Looking fairly good. Now they want the wing mirrors. I do love the way they do the wing mirrors like this. They got two little pieces and it's just getting sitting going, that's your wing mirror? Yeah. Well, I guess it works. It's a very small wing mirror though. I know it's proportional to the size of the cup, but it's teeny. Huh? Teeny wing mirrors. Done all that. Press that down hard. And there we go. Push. It's one of the Le Mans cars, and I always forget their names. I'm sorry, I'm not as big a fan of Le Mans cars as I am of Legos. But I just looked at the car and thought, that's going to be cool to build. But it's not one of the ones I actually know. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I did promise that this one would have the question. I'm sorry I was a bit quiet at the end, finishing off and making sure it was all done correct, but you know. I'm going to stick that there, so you can see it while I'm talking. What is the question going to be? Well, the question is this. How would you square the circle that is the procurement challenge? What systems, looking at them currently, would you like to emulate and probably produce better versions of? Because you could argue the LCS was an attempt to square that circle by making them a modular design. But the thing is, the Americans were trying to make modular at the level of perfect, instead of the Danish going, well, technology's not really at the level at which we can do perfect and modular terminology at the moment. But what we can do is we can do average, i.e. standardized systems. Not systems which are the absolute cutting edge of the cutting edge systems, although they're very good versions of the systems they are. But let's be honest, the enhanced Sea Sparrow, which was the main missile for many years, it's a good missile. It's not the most advanced. When I say it's not the most taxing, because it is a shorter range missile. It's not the largest. Same with Harpoon, etc. Harpoon is a very good missile, but it's not the most taxing in terms of its requirements. So, how do you square that circle? Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it interesting, and, well, this was the discussion. So, take care.